Hello and welcome to Daily Aus. I'm Sam Koslowski.
I'm Billi FitzSimons. Wait, before we get into the deep dive.
Yeah.
It's a big day, 3rd of October.
3rd of October, it's 2 days before my mum's 60th birthday.
And Taylor Swift is also dropping an album today. And it's the Mean Girls meme day.
Which means that most of TDA's office will not do any work today.
No. Wait, do you know what I'm saying when I say the Mean Girls meme day?
That it's a date mentioned in the diary in Mean Girls?
Yes, pretty much.
I'm up with it.
Big day. Big day for the girls.
Big day, and I'm sorry to kind of change the tone of this conversation, but we're talking about US politics. It's a big day for US politics, not as exciting as a new Taylor Swift album. And it's shut down after Congress failed to pass funding legislation. It's the 21st shutdown since 1977, and it has triggered the indefinite pause of most federal services, putting tens of thousands of federal employees out of work. On today's podcast, we're not going to talk about the new Taylor Swift album. Instead, we're going to break down what a shutdown actually means, how an entire government can just stop, and why this one might be different from past shutdowns.
Sam, when I first saw this story, my first thought was not again, because I feel like this happens every single year. But then I just realized that there's kind of talk about it happening or there's a threat of it happening.
Exactly.
But this time it's actually come to fruition.
We're here.
We are here. My understanding is that it all centers around the budget. Do you want to explain exactly what this process is?
Sure. So the US government operates on a fiscal year that runs from the 1st of October to the 30th of September the following year. And towards the end of each fiscal year, Congress needs to pass legislation to fund federal operations for the next year. So a tick of approval on the money that federal operations such as the military, but also the National Park Service or a lot of the health authorities in the country need to function. And all of this starts in February, and that's when the president usually proposes the budget and then he sends it to Congress to review it. Just like in Australia, the budget is a political reflection of what the priorities are of that government or the president. And almost always the two sides, so the Republicans and the Democrats, they're going to disagree on some measures, and that's when they enter a period of negotiation. And that period between February and September, so, a good chunk, 50% of the time spent is on making sure the next year's budget is approved. But if they can't reach an agreement by the 30th of September, they've got two options really ahead of them. They can either pass what's called a continuing resolution or a CR. It's basically a band-aid. It's basically saying, let's give enough funding for like 30 or 60 days so that we can keep negotiating, or they can shut the government down.
Right. And so this time they shut the government down because they couldn't agree?
Exactly. They couldn't, not only could they not agree on the federal budget, they couldn't agree on the terms of that continuing resolution either.
Right.
And what happens then is the government shuts down literally at midnight on the 1st of October. They don't have money that's been approved by Congress to operate, and they have to cease non-essential operations. That's a shutdown, and that's where we are right now.
You've mentioned Congress a few times. In Australia, we don't have Congress. So do you want to just explain exactly what that is? Because it's critical to understanding how this has happened.
In many ways, it is similar to the Australian model. It's different in terms of the leader of the country, being the president, is not in Congress, whereas here, Anthony Albanese as a prime minister would be the leader of the House of Reps.
Yep.
But Congress has two chambers, just like us. They've got the House of Representatives and the Senate. In the House of Representatives, a party needs 218 votes to pass a bill before it can be sent up to the Senate. Right now, the Republicans have a majority by one. They've got 219 seats. The Democrats have 213, and there's 3 spots that are vacant. And in the Senate, most bills need 51 votes to pass. It's 100 seats in the Senate. But spending bills, like a budget, need 60 votes. Now, the problem is that the Republicans have 53 seats there. So they've got enough to pass another bill, but when it comes to budgetary bills, they don't have enough. They actually need the support of 7 Democrats. The Democrats have 47 seats, then there's 2 independents, and that's where things have fallen down.
Got it. So the budget was able to pass the House because the Republicans control the House.
Exactly.
But then it wasn't able to pass the Senate because even though they have a majority there, they don't have enough of a majority to pass a budget.
Exactly. And that's where that negotiation point I made earlier really came into play, is the Democrats basically said, we will support the passage of this budget through the Senate if you give us A, B, and C. The Republicans couldn't meet those demands, and that's where things fell apart.
And so what happens during a shutdown? Like, do people just stop working?
Well, a chunk of the federal government stops operating. About 25% of the federal government completely stops. I think the National Park Service is a really interesting one. So these are the employees who would sit at a boom gate of cars looking to enter a national park, or they'd be working on sustainability measures in the park, safety. That's not seen as an essential service. So those people are immediately furloughed or cut, essentially. The other 75% continues. And we're talking there about things like air traffic control or security at an airport, police, ambulances, that kind of stuff. They continue, but employees don't get paid.
So they're required to rock up to work, but they know that they might not be paid for that for a while until this budget goes through.
Exactly. So they're back paid when the budget does eventually go through. They're paid for all of their time. But the 25% that is kind of dismissed on the spot, we're talking there about 4 million federal employees.
That's a lot. So 4 million people who no longer work and suddenly wake up knowing that they don't have a paycheck coming.
Yeah, and it's a bit more complicated than that in terms of most of these shutdowns are resolved in a couple of days, and these people are immediately rehired, and there's a gap where they weren't covered, but then it's kind of business as usual. But it can get really messy. I mean, there are non-essential federal employees who may suddenly have to use food services, or there's stories about kids being withdrawn from school because parents who are non-essential employees can't afford petrol to get in their car. Then there's also stories of like military personnel who are told to continue working, but may go a full month without a paycheck.
Okay, so I understand what happens during the shutdown. One thing that I think we've kind of skimmed over is what actually led to this and what in particular the Democrats and the Republicans aren't agreeing on that has meant that this shutdown has happened.
Hi, I'm Ola.
And I'm Elliot.
We're the two-person team behind everything video and audio here at the Daily Aus.
If you want to help us grow so we can deliver more of the content that you love, be sure to hit subscribe.
Now let's get back to the video.
So the Republican-controlled House, they passed that continuing resolution I spoke about, the Band-Aid. They passed that in September. That would have given everybody funding until the end of November. And we got some clues in that as to what the key issues were. And essentially, we're talking here about probably two primary issues. One is the bucket of healthcare, the very complex bucket of healthcare in the US. Democrats essentially wanted temporary healthcare subsidies introduced under former President Barack Obama. You might have heard the term Obamacare. So those were temporary subsidies that are about to expire. And Democrats wanted to make them permanent subsidies. Republicans opposed this. They said that this would really ramp up the cost of the American healthcare system. Who pays for the system? It's taxpayers. That would put pressure on cost of living. Then there's also some proposed cuts by the Republicans to particular health agencies. The new head of America's health system, RFK Jr., has some controversial policies on things like vaccines or the treatment of some infectious diseases. Then a third problem in healthcare is the availability of healthcare to undocumented migrants. Then you have another topic of presidential authority. And this won't surprise people listening, but Democrats wanted to restrict the president's ability to withhold funding for programs that had already been approved by Congress. So an example would be an $18 billion infrastructure program for New York that would have upgraded trains around the city of New York City. That passed Congress, and then President Trump used his powers to defund that program. So Democrats wanted to remove that power to do that to programs that had been approved. Republicans said that we need to look to the Supreme Court ruling. The Supreme Court recently ruled that that's okay to do, and that executive control, according to the Constitution, needs to stay with the president.
What I think is interesting is, you know, America is so divided politically. And the fact that they do need to negotiate on these points that are so fraught between the two parties, it's almost surprising to me that this doesn't happen more.
Well, I feel like there's so much money in that budget that both sides will often find ways to make each other happy-ish.
Yes.
And to, you give a little bit of leniency over here in healthcare, we'll make sure that there's more in, defense of the southern border.
Yeah.
And there's this big kind of to and fro process because both parties know that eventually the other one will be in power. And so there's also a bit of kind of a favor system and a negotiation system of some of these politicians have been working together for 30, 40 years. So they have the trust to be able to build a negotiated budget together.
What have past shutdowns been like? Because like you said at the top, this isn't the first time it's happened.
Yeah, well, I was reading, I think every president, maybe except one since the 70s, has had a shutdown. Some are a couple of days. The longest one in history was 35 days, and that was in 2018. And in that scenario, 300,000 federal workers were furloughed, so they were dismissed, and they were totally unpaid in that period. Usually a federal government shutdown is seen as this really negative thing by both Republicans and Democrats. And so it's normally resolved pretty quickly. Neither party want to answer to their constituents of why am I out of work? Why can't I access public resources? And so 35 days was pretty long. And I think the second longest was in the 20s. So that was a rarity in itself. Analysts say that we could be headed towards the 35-day mark and even beyond.
Really?
Yeah.
So we think that this is going to go on for a long time.
Yeah, and the phrase that a lot of US media outlets are using is that this shutdown feels different.
Why?
Well, the reason really is the way that the Trump administration is talking about the shutdown. The president sets the tone, especially for the Republicans who control the House and control the Senate. He's positioning it as a way to actually permanently close some of the federal agencies that his administration has been talking about wanting to close for a long time. And so think about it like these people are dismissed because there's no more funding for the federal government for, say, 2 weeks. It's an opportunity for the Trump administration to actually permanently take away that institution.
And this is part of, we know that US President Donald Trump is wanting to cut spending from the budget. So he's kind of seeing this as a way to do that.
Exactly. And that's not a new idea. There was a similar threat to shut down the government back in March with the previous year's budget. And Chuck Schumer, who's one of the senior members of the Democrats, he actually decided to vote with the Republicans to avoid what he said would be a situation where Trump could permanently dismantle some of these agencies. Now, 6 months on, Schumer has flipped his vote. And he's actually said, I know that I said that back in March. Now that we're here in October, the threat to our democracy is too real. We need to take stronger action than a negotiated outcome.
It's such a complex situation, but...
Yeah, sorry, I thought that was a complex one. I feel that. Definitely ask questions in the comments or DM us, because that's a lot to take in.
I feel like every time I said, this is my understanding, you're like, yeah, kind of, but it's a lot more complex than that.
Well, people have designed over 250 years a US system that is really, really complex, whichever way you turn.
Well, thank you so much for explaining it to us.
Thanks, Billy.
And thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Daily Aus. We hope that you have a great October 3rd. There is much to celebrate today.
There is.
We'll be back this afternoon with your evening headlines, but until then, have a great day.